Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Powerful Perspectives. I would like to share a story with you all today from my childhood. When I was young, I'm not sure exactly how old I was, probably around like 8 or 10 years old, somewhere in here. I visited my aunt and uncle, and they lived on a farm in kind of like a smaller town in Canada. And yeah, I was there with my siblings. I don't know how many of my siblings were there with me. I think probably all of them at the time. But my brother and I have a younger brother, 2 years younger than I. And we were playing outside in the sandbox. And there was this kind of like, there was a sandbox that was attached to this wooden, like a playground kind of that was on the yard of my aunt and uncle's farm. And we were playing out there, and unbeknownst to us, there was like a wasp's nest that was there in one of the corners of the wooden structure of this playground and sandbox. And so my brother and I were playing there, and I guess we got too close or like bumped the hive or the wasp's nest there, and yeah, we got stung. Like there was like a swarm of wasps that came and stung us. I wasn't so close. I think it was my brother who was closer and who knocked it or got too close somehow, kind of upset them. He got stung quite a few times, like all over. I got stung maybe once or twice. And I got stung primarily on my hand, I remember, and I think he also got stung on his hand, maybe in some other places as well. But we were just kind of, I mean, getting stung by wasps is never fun, right? And we were young, and especially for my brother who got stung like more than I did, it was a bit of a traumatic experience, right? So we run into the house. Tell my aunt what had happened, and she kind of gets this cream and like ointment and kind of puts it on our stings, like where, you know, on our sores where we gotten stung. And I remember we asked if we could play Nintendo. They had a Nintendo 64 at the time, and that was like, I don't think we had one at that point in our lives. We got one later on, but that was one of our favorite things to do. Is we just thought that was so cool to play those games, especially like Donkey Kong, like the original, like not Donkey Kong and Mario, but yeah, just like Donkey Kong with like Diddy and Tiny and Lanky and, you know, all of them, just like kind of the brawl. So we enjoyed playing that a lot, along with, yeah, there was like Mario Kart and other games, and but it was a privilege. We didn't get to play the Nintendo all the time. I mean, obviously, like we were children, and I really love this and appreciate this about like my parents and their generation at the time. There was a lot more focus on playing outdoors and having other kinds of activities, other types of games, and not just being in front of the screen all the time, right? And so we didn't play all the time, but we were excited when we did get to play, right? And we always had to ask permission, of course, and yeah. And so I remember asking if we could play, right? And the idea in my little mind, you know, as a child was like, oh, this is gonna help me to feel better, right? And so my brother and I played, you know, the Nintendo for like an hour and a half, maybe, something like that. It's hard to remember time frames, you know, especially with a younger mind where time is measured differently to us, you know, through our subjective experience. But we played for a while, you know, and I remember after having played the Nintendo, we felt better. Like we didn't recognize as much pain from the wasp stings and everything, and we just felt a lot better. And to our young minds, for my brother and I, we attributed that change, we attributed that that release of pain and that, you know, that ceasing of pain, we kind of attributed that to playing the video game, right? We didn't so much attribute like yes, like we had like the creams and stuff like put on our sores as well, and like that maybe helped a little bit. But we kind of we associated the playing Nintendo with being one of the things that helped us feel better, right? Certainly we didn't think of it simply being the passing of time. And I want to share this experience because I want to kind of bring up a comparison between physical and mental health, and the part that attention versus distraction plays in this. So with physical ailments, like our bodies are incredible, and they're designed in such a way that they heal themselves, right? Like you get a cut or a bruise, and as long as it's not super severe, and even really when it is, you know, you might need some help, like if it's like a really deep cut, or like you might need stitches or something like this, you might like tape or glue or whatever to hold the wound together. You obviously need to clean it out and make sure it doesn't get infected and things like this. But the wound, like for all intents and purposes, it'll heal itself, right? Sometimes like there might be a scar left over that shows, you know, like where that original like cut was and where the healing took place. But besides a mark, there's really not that much evidence really that anything ever happened there, right? And the majority of the time, especially for smaller, you know, scrapes and bruises and things, like a few days, maybe a week passes, and you have no indication that there was ever anything there or anything that happened, right? Our bodies are incredible at healing themselves. Healthy bodies, right? I understand that there are definitely like different diseases, like immune diseases and other things like that can affect this, right? That can affect the body's ability to rejuvenate and heal itself. But for the most part, for the majority of cases, yeah, the body heals itself more often than not, right? And that's a really beautiful thing. And it means, or it kind of shows in the majority of times, in the majority of instances, really the best healing strategy for the body is just time. Like it's really just a question of time. The body needs time to heal itself. And it needs like different nutrients, it needs different vitamins, it needs like water, right? Good sleep, exercise, things like this, right? Like different endorphins, different, like it all helps with that. And sometimes like certain antibiotics might help, you know, in fighting different diseases, different bacteria, etc., different viruses that might be in our body. But more often than not, like the body can just kind of plow forward with that on its own. Like, again, like sometimes it'll need help, but really the greatest determining factor in someone being well again is really just a matter of time, you know, even after like intervention from a doctor or from a surgeon. Like if someone undergoes surgery, right, really it's just a matter of time. There might be certain follow-up medications that need to be taken to help the body heal itself faster, right, and to kind of expedite that process as much as we can. But that process is more often than not going to happen on its own anyway. And so really it's just a matter of time. And in those instances, right, with physical ailments and physical harm, where time is really kind of the main variable that makes the difference in us getting well again, distraction can be a wonderful tool, because if our attention is on our bodily harm, like is on our wounds, like our cuts, our like not feeling well, like if that's where all of our attention is, then that time is going to feel like an eternity, right? And so it is wise and it is prudent and it is probably productive and helpful for us to find ways to distract ourselves um, while we're overcoming physical ailments, physical harm, right? Um, like watching movies when we're sick, you know, you have the flu or something and we just like binge watch like Netflix, like we're distracting ourselves, right? Because like you don't want to just sit and wallow in like your nausea, right? Like that's not like, it's not productive or helpful, and it's not going to help you to get over it any faster, right? Like obviously you take like medications or whatever, like you try to do those things that will help you out. You get lots of rest, drink lots of water, etc., etc. Do what you can to help your body, like, you know, provide your body the things that it needs to help you and to heal you. But then it's really just like a question of time, right? And what we choose to do with that time, it makes a difference in the experience. And so if we can distract ourselves, like by watching movies or by talking to people or whatever, right? Like playing games, whatever we can do to kind of distract ourselves in the interim, like while our body is kind of undergoing that healing process, I think that does us good most of the time, right? The difficulty that we run into is when we take this same metric and apply it to mental health. Because the rubric and the process and how mental health works, it's not the same as our bodies. It's not the same as our physical health. There are some connections and correlates, maybe, some similarities. And certainly in terms of like the physical brain and like the biology of our brain, yes, like the brain is able to rejuvenate and heal in some ways. In other ways, it really isn't. Like when certain damage is done to the brain, it is not able to like regenerate that. It's not able to recover or heal from that. The brain as an organ, or like it's very flexible. It's very like malleable. It's amazing just like how different parts of the brain can compensate for different things. And so if there's damage to a certain part of the brain, sometimes another part of the brain will take over the functions that part of the brain originally took care of or like looked after, right? And so we describe this, well, we use the word plasticity kind of to describe just how flexible the brain is in terms of different functions that it can take care of in different areas sometimes, right? But that isn't universally true. Like it's not true with every function, it's not true with every part of the brain, right? There is some ability and capability to do that. But it still doesn't mean that part of the brain that originally took care of that function, or that, you know, was processing or doing that, heals. It could just be that another part of the brain maybe steps in and takes care of some of that, or tries to compensate for some of that. But yeah, so biologically, there's maybe some like, you know, connection with the rest of our body and how it heals. But there's also like, there are significant ways in which the brain is not able to heal itself, whereas other parts of our bodies are perhaps more able to do so. But getting out of the biological and like physical realm of it, right, and getting more into kind of the mental, the cognitive, the emotional, you could even say in some ways the spiritual sometimes, those areas don't really follow the same pattern for health and healing that our bodies do. There, it's not always time itself as like kind of an isolated variable that heals or that makes better. Oftentimes it takes effort and it takes conscious decision to face things and wrestle with them and work through them. Here, avoidance is not the strategy, right? And distraction is not the strategy. In many cases, actually, distraction and avoidance, they only compound or add on to the problem. They just make it bigger. And you can see this come up in a lot of different mental health concerns, right? You can see this in different forms of addiction. You can see this like in whether it be like alcohol, whether it be drugs, whether it be like sexual impulsivity, or sexual addiction, whether it be like eating disorders, right? All of these things, like social media as well, and relationships, like attachment issues even. I wouldn't necessarily call, well, I guess in some ways you could conceptualize some attachment issues as a form of addiction, right? You can kind of paint it under a similar umbrella in terms of just how the struggles or issues, how they operate, right? And how they affect a person and how the person interacts with them. But in so many of these areas, right, oftentimes our impulse or our desire or our attempt is to find something to distract us, because we don't like pain, right? It's uncomfortable, right? And I don't know if I could say that we necessarily learn this process or this pattern from how we interact with our physical bodies, right? It could be that subconsciously to some level there's a connection there, right? And we kind of reason within ourselves saying, well, you know, if I distract myself from things physically, with time it just takes care of itself. So the same thing will happen with like my mental, you know, difficulties, with the same thing will happen with my insecurities, the same thing will happen with my attachment issues, the same thing will happen with my addictive impulses or drives, right? Like that'll just take care of itself as long as I distract myself in some way. No, it doesn't work this way. And there may be many people who know that and realize that, especially when it's said kind of plainly. There are a lot of people who maybe don't realize that, or who think that they do in some way, but then like maybe mentally or cognitively, like we understand it, like kind of conceptually, like on a logical level, like we can kind of put that together and say, okay, like, yeah, that makes sense. But then in terms of how that looks in practice and how we actually integrate that into our lives, that becomes a lot more complicated, right? And it's a lot harder to see. But I just wanted to kind of bring that up and point out that distinction and that difference. With mental health, avoidance is not the strategy, and distractions, they can seem sometimes like they offer temporary relief, right? Not dealing with something that is overwhelming to you, or that is stressful to you, or that is painful, or, you know, like uncomfortable, you can successfully avoid it to a point, right? And it really depends on just how intense the distraction is. Some forms of distraction are stronger or more potent than others. They can also be stronger or more potent within certain circumstances, right? Done or taken at certain intervals or with different intensities, or just in different environments. It's really a case-by-case kind of subjective question. But at the end of the day, it's really just slapping a Band-Aid on something, right? It's this idea of like, if you get like a really, really deep cut, right? Like you can like almost like you can see like the fat in your in your arm, let's say that has been cut or something, you know, like you can, like it's really deep. And you just like kind of slap a Band-Aid on it and then like kind of go about your day and try to distract yourself with something else. Yeah, your attention, like the fact that you've moved your attention to something else will offer some form of relief to an extent, right? But it doesn't take care of that wound. It's not directly taking care of the issue, and that issue will fester, it'll get infected, and it'll cause more harm than good. And the longer the longer you leave it, and this is again like a crucial difference between like our physical bodies and our mental health. The longer you leave it without dealing with it, the more it festers, the more it gets infected. And like it could be that like at some point like you need to amputate the whole arm, right? Like because the infection spreads so much, you know, and you've just been ignoring it for so long, like, and you ignore it long enough. And I don't want to get morbid here, but you ignore it long enough and it will kill you. Like many issues of mental and emotional health, if ignored long enough, if distracted from long enough, they will suck you of your life. Whether that be literally through self-harm or through suicide, or whether that be just through loss of control and impulsivity, right, and various other ways that end up with someone losing their life, or even if it's not like their actual physical life that is lost, but their quality and caliber of life, right? They may be alive, but they're no longer living, if that makes sense. What they're experiencing can no longer be qualified, really, or can no longer be, it can no longer be like labeled or identified as life, because it's empty and void of any real meaning or emotion or connection. So you're basically living hell on earth, right? Is kind of the idea. And it's not just an idea. It's a reality. It's a lived reality for so many people. And so this is kind of the warning that I want to kind of share today, is that this suffering is a heck of a lot more than the suffering of just cleaning the wound to begin with. You know, like who of us after like, you know, falling off a bike and getting all scratched up, like we don't like putting alcohol, like rubbing alcohol or whatever on the wound to clean it, right? We don't like disinfecting. It burns, it hurts, it's not comfortable, right? But what we don't see in that moment, because of our short-sightedness, and because of our preoccupation with the present pain, right? Our attention again is focused on like my hurt now and kind of getting out of that and avoiding that now. We're not thinking ahead. We're not thinking of the future. We're kind of consumed by what's happening in the present. And in that state, we kind of conflate, or we overestimate the pain of cleaning and taking care of the wound now, and we underestimate the pain of leaving it and avoiding it and just distracting ourselves from it and going on with our day. We underestimate the effect that can have and just how painful that will be in the long run. And not all, like it doesn't always have to be like years out, right? Like when I say long run, it doesn't need to be like in 10, 20 years. It can happen in the next weeks, the next month. Like it can be like shorter term as well, right? Some of these things, they get infected and they fester really fast, especially like, you know, depending on what our environment is, like, you know, someone who like gets all scratched up and then goes like in the forest and is rolling around in the mud and in the dirt or whatever, or like, or I don't know, goes into like a hospital where they're surrounded by like all these germs and everything, right? Like, depending on what your circumstances are and what your surroundings are, like it can develop a whole lot faster than you think it will. And so I say that not to scare you, but in some ways I do want to scare you. Because I hope that if we take this seriously and maybe are a little bit scared about it, maybe we'll take action and maybe we'll take it seriously. And I would suggest that it's much more productive and much more helpful to be scared of what things can develop into if they're left unattended, rather than to be scared of the pain or discomfort of wrestling with it in the here and now. So I share that lovingly, and with concern, and with sympathy and empathy. As someone trained as a mental health therapist, like, this is really near and dear to my heart. And so I would encourage all of you, whoever, is listening to this, and especially those who recognize some personal relevance in this, who can recognize, okay, like, maybe I have a bit of a tendency, to distract with this thing or that thing, or, I promise you that facing the thing that you're avoiding, it will be uncomfortable. It will be hard. It will be painful. But it will be a lot less difficult, a lot less painful than if you leave these things to grow and fester and develop and get infected, and just, if you continue to avoid them, they will just destroy your life. Time is not your friend. Avoidance is not your friend. Distraction is not your friend. Facing it is really what is your friend in this case. And the beautiful thing here is that you don't need to face it alone. Just like we have doctors and physicians and surgeons and different different physical health, like different health professionals, medical professionals who help us with our physical health. There are mental health professionals too, who are willing and able and eager to be a resource and to support you through that process, so that you don't need to go through it alone. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of that as much as you can. And I look forward to the blessings that can bring into your life. And I leave that with you. And any questions, comments, like, please feel free to mention those in the comments, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.